I hope you can all see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so today we want to look at literature review, research problems, and research questions. So why begin with this? This is the beginning of research in its essence. This is how we begin our research, by literature review. We begin by that's where we begin to formulate our research problems and then our research questions at the end. So we hope this will be the beginning, first of all, to help us with our own research, if we can start now, understand what it means to do literature review, how we can do it, and the different sources that we can use for literature review. So essentially, what does literature review mean? Normally, for most of us, when we think about it, we are thinking about our chapter 2, because that was most likely the format we used when we were doing our research. But literature review is much more than just chapter 2. It's essentially your entire research. You're doing literature throughout your research. So we look at it in the sense that this is where we begin to build our research. You've noticed I've given you, from the beginning, I gave you articles, published articles. And all the people who were doing this research pointed to previous research. Why? Because previous research is what tells us where is the gap that me as a researcher I need to fill. What is that gap that I need to fill? And it's previous research that points out, it helps us to frame our research. It helps us to point out the gap. It helps us to point out what has been done where I probably shouldn't bother, or maybe where I can try to replicate the research and ascertain, maybe in a different context, if the same results will be found, then therefore build on, or where basically fill in those gaps. So that's what literature review essentially is, the significance of it in a nutshell. So that's what we mean, that it points out the major research topic that will be research. It introduces us to that, what needs to be discussed. We begin by identifying a broad area. We start with a broad area. Now, we had earlier said, I remember in one of our discussions, we said, for most of us, we begin by identifying, we begin by noticing our research problem in quotes in our workplaces most of the time. At the time when you notice it at your workplace, it's an organizational problem. It's not a research problem. Therefore, it needs to be conceptualized. It needs to be conceptualized now at a research level, that it stops being an organizational problem, that you're not just solving your organizational problem. You're solving a research problem, something that is yet unknown, or a little bit is known, or has not yet been validated in the research world. So we start by that. We globalize it, should I say, in the research world. And then the literature review can also tend to extensively over globalize, or we may not be guided clearly on how to do it. For example, it needs to be broad, but it also needs to be narrow. Seems like a contradiction, but that's the way it is. It needs to be broad, but it also needs to be narrow. Take an example of the different articles we've seen. If let us say, look at the group where we published article. If these people had gone ahead to start defining the groupware application, start telling us, okay, leave aside groupware application, if they had begun telling us about ICT ICT in general, the history of ICT, where ICT began from, where computers began from, then applications, and that was taking us outside of the research area. And in that sense, the reader doesn't want to know anymore. Yeah, your reader doesn't want to know. So you need to keep the attention of your reader. And your reader, remember, number one, you may think it's your supervisor, but at master's level, it's beyond your supervisor. It goes to the external examiner, because the external examiner is the one who determines whether you pass or fail, not your supervisor. So you need to keep your reader in focus about what it is you're trying to deal with. So you need to, as you're reviewing your literature, make sure you don't go outside of your scope. Your supervisor can help you on that. So like here we give examples in discussing the history of education when the topic is instructional strategy, for example, is a typical example of where you're going outside. Keep it within your research area or research problem. Don't attempt to cover everything on your topic. And this, we see that especially when students write, when they begin to write, what is your research problem? And someone wants to do every single little thing. Let's look at another example of the multitasking article that IS students had. These people were looking, they had, and good enough for them, they had even hypotheses. They were looking at, they were examining not just that that smartphone applications or certain applications induce a hedonic experience. That means induce pleasure. And they were basically trying to look at it in relation to multitasking. So their research was trying to show that there are certain applications that induce high levels of pleasure. And if you try to do it when you're multitasking, you will lose focus. So for example, if I was looking, yesterday I mentioned that I like TikTok. So imagine me on a TikTok video while I'm driving at the same time. What would happen? That would automatically cause an accident. So these researchers were specifically focusing on trying to determine levels of pleasure and how it may reduce our effect on other things. Now imagine if they had decided to go ahead and even to also to do research, to go beyond that, not just the laboratory experiments, but also to go in a driving situation, to even show accidents that happen and so on and so forth. It would not allow them to go through the scientific process to prove that certain applications induce high levels of pleasure. Rather, they just focused on their research on that, on the fact that certain applications induce high levels of pleasure while you're doing other tasks and may take away your attention. That's all they focused on. They didn't try to solve everything. Now, this is one of the important things to note as you're doing research, one of the guiding principles you should have behind your back. You're not here to solve everything. You're not here to solve the world problems, world peace, and so on and so forth. It's been, I don't know, over 2,000 years since Jesus came, we still haven't attained peace. In spite of all the understanding we have now of even our different religions, not just Christianity, but all the different religions, but we still haven't attained world peace. So even in research, make sure your topic is enough for you to cover, not to solve every single little thing. So narrowing down your research to what is researchable, what is solvable. So that is, again, your supervisor helps you a lot. You use the studies in your research as evidence that your research question is important. So we don't just use our literature review to narrow down our research, but also to give weight that our research question is also important. So you divide up your literature review in several aspects. In other words, as you're reviewing your literature, one, your research problem, two, giving it context, and three, giving it weight, significance. So those are the general the general guidelines that we follow. Now, it is important also to review literature to help you cover all the variables that are being studied. So now, this one is now, we are moving beyond chapter 1. We are now going to chapter 2 to review literature that will look at all the variables you're looking at. Remember yesterday I gave you an example for my chapter 2. I used that to identify, or rather to describe in detail, the different different variables that theory guided me would affect sustainability. So I looked at literacy levels. I looked at the healthcare context, distance to healthcare facilities. I looked at poverty levels. I looked at access to mobile phones in rural areas, and so on and so forth. So that was literature helping me, and that the literature I got from Bureau of Statistics. I got from publications on rural areas, and so on and so forth. So these helped to beef up my different variables from the domains chapter. So that research explains the relationship between the variables as a top priority. So the literature review itself already explains, it begins to explain the variables or the identified variables. So in that sense, this is what literature does. Now, remember what I'd said earlier, you now begin to plan your literature review on structuring your research. So how do we plan? We start with the topical order. Organize the main topics or main issues that emphasize the research problem. So you begin to look for your literature review basing on your research problem. Which topics would I search on? For example, the authors of groupware application, they would have probably started, but they wanted to know if they were looking at their research problem on groupware applications, they probably wanted to find out what research has been done on groupware applications. And there were probably different types of research. And then they realized they probably had seen the organizational problem, yes, but when they went to literature review, they found most of the research was done in laboratory research. And then they found there was that literature which was pointing out that there are most likely other, how do I put it? There were most likely other research, should I say, other people who are pointing out that, you know what, in a live setting, there are probably some social forces that will have an influence. So they said, okay, why don't we work on that? So that the topical part is the one which helped them find out, get those areas, the gaps that are actually existing. Then you come to chronological order. Now, this is a key point in literature review. If any literature that you are getting regarding your research problem should really be, or research that has been done should really be up to date. You cannot start pointing out a research problem from an article that was published, for example, in 2012, yet we are now in 2023. In 2023 going on to 2024. We are more or less, we are beyond the half point. So your literature review should really be up to date. Look from now, from 2019, 2020, 2021, what is being said about your research problem. There are some articles which can go back. For example, if it's a definition, it's a definition of a research method, if it's a definition of your specific research topic, something, if it's a definition, that is fine. But in terms of what has research that has been done, especially on your research problem, this should be as recent as we possibly can get it. So bear in mind the chronological order. Yes, Tom, you have a question.
Thank you, Doctor. Good morning. I
Good
joined
morning.
a little bit late. Your point on chronological order. What happens if a researcher is tackling a research problem in an area that is not heavily researched about, and all the literature that he comes across is a little bit outdated?
That's a good question, Tom. That's a very good question. A research area that has not been researched about. Now, something must have been said about it. So, Tom, I'll give you an example, specifically for my research. When I was doing my research, I was looking at designing a sustainable mHealth application. A sustainable mHealth application. Now, what research had been done on sustainability of mHealth? That was the first question. The answer was none. None had been done. But there had been research done on mHealth. Most of the research that was done on mHealth was to see effect, if there was a positive effect. So most of the research that was on mHealth was at that time when I was doing my research, was there were these applications that were developed to support adherence to drug treatment. So for example, for TB, HIV. So they would develop these applications where they send reminders to patients to take their drugs. And so the research was to find out if it did actually bring about adherence, and the answer was yes. So all that was the research on mHealth, but there was no research on sustainability. So one, my literature review pointed out the research, or I pointed out, I didn't discuss it, I just simply pointed out that all the research that has been done was on adherence, and I referenced it, all the research that was on adherence. And then there were, of course, different other applications that had been put up. But there was literature, Tom, that was stating that, number one, there was lack of sustainability in ICT4D in general. And two, the second thing that was pointed out is that in ICT4D, in all research, the reason why we don't have sustainability was, one, there was no rigorous research, meaning taking something through the scientific process. All the research that was being done was out of, in quotes, hype, that saying ICT4D will leapfrog us into the 21st century, and so on and so forth. But there was nothing to do, there was no rigorous research to see what works and what does not work. So that was the first gap, that there needed to be a research where there was rigorous research being done. Two, the second gap that was pointed out by researchers is that there was a disconnect between the ICT4D designers and development studies. So there's the field of development studies, then there's the field of ICT, and the two were not properly married. So now, what was my research doing? I was going to close those two gaps. One, introduce rigorous research. So I was going to bring in method and theory. And two, I was going to introduce the field of development studies. So one, I introduced, that's where I introduced a framework which had been developed for evaluating mobile applications if they were sustainable. And two, I brought in a framework from the development studies field. So that was my contribution. At the end of it, I produced a model, but that was my contribution. So Tom, in other words, there was no research on sustainability of mHealth. That was one. But there had been other research on mHealth. So I pointed out all the research focused on this. And then indeed other mHealth researchers were saying, or other ICT for D researchers were saying, there's no rigorous research being applied. And two, we are divorcing ICT from development studies, and these applications are essentially there for development. So Tom, there must be something that has been reported. Someone must have reported something. Or even, like, for example, someone saying, there must be someone who has reported that no research has been done on this. And that becomes your gap. So Tom, I don't know if I answer your question.
We shall I'll pick it on that way.
Okay. Now, the final thing is organize your literature according to the problem, to the solution area. So organize your literature review that you start with the problem and then move on to, okay, then how do we solve the problem? So I was actually even giving you that sample from my research. Ruth, you have a question?
Yes, Doctor. Good morning. Yes, about what you just spoke on actually qualifying that there was no research may be done about the particular topic, and looking at our case where we have like time constraints, and yesterday you talked about someone doing I think qualitative or quantitative research where they will collect data in the period of like 3 months. So how do you comb the entire internet and then you come up and say, okay, this is what exists, this is where they ended, and there is actually no research to this end?
Okay, Ruth, that is a good question. How do we comb the whole internet to find out what has been done, what has not been done? Now, this is where first of all, our resources, the resources that we have on hand. Let me just do a practical demonstration. Let me first stop sharing. Give me a minute. And I open up a link. So you can all see my screen now. Can you all see my screen? Okay.
Yes, Doctor.
Let us think of, let us first start with the first most important, Google Scholar. We all know Google Scholar. Have we used it before? Are there those who haven't seen Google Scholar?
Yes.
We have used it before.
You've used it before. So Google Scholar is one of the most helpful tools, I would say, because it normally points out areas of research, or rather published articles, some of the most published articles, those which are freely available, those which are not available. Now, let us say we have a research topic. Can we think of any research topic? Can someone who has a good idea of a research topic they may want to research on?
Doctor.
Yes, please.
can we think of the challenges and prospects of studying online?
Let us not make it as broad as challenges and prospects. Let's narrow it down further. Why are you thinking of that? We want to narrow it down further, because if we just put challenges and prospects, we shall get those ones. That means they have been found out. So we want to go further than that. Let us look at a research topic that is researchable for us as ICT and IS. If we're thinking about the online studying, what exactly are you thinking about?
Maybe we can look at the feasibility of online studies.
The feasibility of online studies. And what are you thinking about specifically? We want to make it a researchable topic. What are you thinking about specifically?
In that regard, I'm trying to think about probably the affordability of online studies to less, if we can narrow it to a section of the population, probably in the rural areas.
In rural areas. Let's make it ICT related. Let's try and make it ICT related. Either for IS, or ICT. If we're looking at IS, we are probably looking at accessibility. IS normally thinks about maybe things like designing something that is accessible. So if, let us say, there's an IS student who wants to look at designing an accessible online application, something accessible for the rural context. Yeah. So maybe we can start by looking at designing accessible online applications. So e-learning applications. Then designing, yeah. We can start with that. Here we have the first one, e-learning and accessibility, an exploration of potential role of generic pedagogical tools. So this is one of them. This is looking at the pedagogical side. Designing accessible e-learning applications. This is 2007. That's really quite old. Web applications, model-driven, then proposal towards the development of accessible e-learning content. Developing an e-learning content using mental models to design accessible e-learning applications. This is also 2007. This is 2016. Towards a thematic definition of a framework to implement accessible e-learning projects. This is a good one. They are designing a framework to implement accessible e-learning projects. And here they said to understand the principles of accessibility and designing systems and solutions for everyone. So this is a good one. It is 2016. It was done in 2016. So an IS student can say, let me use this framework to see if I can design an application 4, because it says to bear in mind solutions for everyone. So let me see if I just download this. So someone can begin by reviewing this literature, because this one is proposing a solution. So for an IS student, it is a good one. Let me do a new share. Let's see, where is it? Where is it? Sorry, let me just try and see if I can do a new share, if I can see this. No. Let me first stop sharing. While I answer Andrew's, Andrew has his hand raised. Yes, Andrew?
Thank you, Doctor. I had a question concerning the research topic. What are the building blocks when you're coming up with a research topic? I think that's why the building blocks, like what do we need to pick up in order to make a research topic? Okay.
Now, one, we think about our fields, the different fields we belong. What would be expected of a research student from IS and ICT? That's the first thing. So, one, this is not my personal belief, but in the department, it is believed that, okay, one, you should be bringing new knowledge. That is one. You should be bringing new knowledge. Whether you're designing a system or whatever it is, you should be bringing something new to your field. The department generally prefers development of artifacts. That means a system. Now, for example, if we were following the line of thought which Ruth brought, designing something for a rural area. Now, you find a framework which is being proposed, which was developed in 2016, and it's proposing that you can use this framework to develop applications, web-based applications and content for everyone. Yeah, for everyone. Then someone says, okay, if this can help me design, let me design a system based on this framework. And then I implement it and evaluate it. Does it answer the question for the rural context? And that you either come out with a yes or a no. Yeah. So that is one way this IS student would come up with this topic. For an ICT student, it would be similar thing. We are looking at ICT governance. Normally, ICT governance, we are looking at enterprise architecture, we're looking at strategy, we're looking at policy, and so on and so forth. So typically, we want to see the effectiveness of governance and the different tools that we have, and we bring forward solutions. For me, that is not my thinking entirely. I don't necessarily think that, but normally they would prefer that artifacts are developed. So, Andrew, I don't know if I answer your question, but that's where we would normally begin. Start with your research area. So start with your field, for instance. If, let us say, if we're looking at the issue of what Ruth has raised, the issue of e-learning and the rural context, and someone wants to look, if you're saying that, oh, I want to see if things are affordable. For IS or ICT, that would not be a good area. Why? IS and ICT, we are solution based. We normally want to find solutions. So the issue would then be, okay, we have different tools that have been developed. Can I design, let's say, an application based maybe on a framework which guides, and see if it does produce something that is accessible for those in the rural context? And then at the end, I'll add to the framework saying that this framework does not look at, it was developed maybe for a different context, and maybe propose to the IS field that we have a framework that understands the rural contexts in a developing context, then you propose that this is an area that can guide, that this area does not necessarily produce applications that support that. That for me would be how I would guide you, how you would come up with a research topic. Andrew, I don't know if I answer your question.
Yes, thank you, Doctor. I also wanted to add on my question. Is a policy considered as a final research document or present to the department? Yes, output.
No.
Like what should ICT produce as a research? Because for IS, at least it's a technical thing. But for ICT, it's more of managerial and all that. So they are document-based. So I wanted to understand what line should we take?
Okay, that's a good question. The types of research I've seen done, the good research that I've seen being done in ICT. We are looking in ICT. We are looking at governance, and so I gave you a typical example. An example I've given in this class. For example, we have governance of ICT at national, at organizational level, and we know at national level, there have been proposals for governments have been developing national ICT policies. Now, one of the issues that has been pointed out is the issue of enforcement. There is a need to enforce this policy so that you can have, the effect can be felt. So, there was a student who I was supervising who started by saying, okay, he wanted to develop a framework to enforce national ICT policies in the different agencies, the government arms. That was things like places like NITAU, NIRA, and so on and so forth. Now, when he was doing that, it's okay. Well, that one is okay. There are frameworks which are developed. I've also given you published articles which have developed frameworks. Then I said, okay, it's okay to develop a framework. Can be done, but you can also go beyond just developing a framework. So one of the things I did, I just remember I did a Google search. He wanted to do a framework, which was good, but first things first, find out, has a framework been done before? That's the first thing. Has a framework been done? So Andrew, that was one of the first things I did. So I went to Google. I just remember going to Google. Let me share my screen again. And I just put in a search. Sorry. I just put in a search. Framework to enforce national ICT policy. And immediately I found one, which was developed. This here. Now you see here, there's one developed in Nigeria. There was one the one I found was done in Kenya. So I said, rather than you develop a new framework, why don't you validate this framework by applying it in Uganda, the Ugandan context, and you see the different domains this person developed. They also exist in Uganda because it was developed for Kenya. You see now there's one here. Framework for implementation. This is a framework for implementation. So the one I found was for Kenya. And let me see if we see it here. Let me see if we see it here. No. Let me open in Google itself because I think that's where I found it. National ICT policy. And it is already here. We see a national ICT policy framework. ITU also has something. Let's see. The student is here. Or enforcement. Let's look at enforcement of national ICT policy. You can look at this one in ResearchGate. There's already something here. That's it. This is their proposed framework. This one is a framework for enforcing, I don't know if you see it, a framework for enforcing the national ICT policy in Kenya. So when I found this, so I tell the student that, okay, rather than you developing a new one, why don't you validate this one? See if the domains he points out are actually, they also have the same effect in Uganda when it comes to enforcement. So one, you can develop frameworks. Two, you can validate other frameworks that exist. Or someone can say that there was a policy, a framework developed in this context. I want to customize it to the Ugandan context. And the person goes ahead to determine if those domains exist and then discover other domains that may exist that are unique to Uganda, and then proposes it to the Ugandan, to the ICT, to the ICT research side. So, Andrew, those are some of the things that I would point out. There was also another one, somebody else who did research also in the field of ICT 4D. And there was also a framework that was developed for, this was for implementing community mobile health applications, a framework to implement. So it was developed for South Africa, so he decided to validate it in Uganda, in the Ugandan context. So that gives you room to discover if it suits the Ugandan context, or if you propose areas that can be changed. So therefore, when that framework, as it is developing, that what you're doing is you're building on that research. And that is how, for example, theories like TAM came about, because a framework was proposed, somebody else builds on that new framework, and so on and so forth. So Andrew, I don't know if I've answered your question.
Thank you, Doctor. Because I wanted to also inquire what artifacts should we focus on?
Yes.
Because according to our discussion, it's mostly framework development or evaluation of it,
yes,
or validation of it. So is it usually a framework as an out for our research, or there is another path we can take?
Yeah, there are also others. You can develop models. There are models which have been proposed. For example, you have the strategy alignment model. You can decide to implement it in the Ugandan context, and then propose redefinition or realignment for the Ugandan context, or something like that. So there are different things, not just frameworks, but there are models. There are different things on strategy, on enterprise architecture. There are so many things that are coming up. One of the nice things is that this is a new area. So you can find out, for example, if your interest is enterprise architecture, you can decide to look at what literature is being published on enterprise architecture, maybe in a specific context, in banks, in the banking sector, in the educational sector, and so on and so forth. and build on that, what is being done. Andrew, I don't know if I've answered your question.
Thank you, Doctor.
Yeah, look, for us, in our area, I would look at enterprise architecture, look at TOGAF, what is being published on TOGAF, that's under enterprise architecture. Look at strategy alignment models, what is being done about it, digital strategy, things like that. I would look in those areas. Those would be the topical areas that I would focus on. Then bring it down to our context, our Ugandan context. There could be a digital strategy maybe that is being proposed for a European context. Then you say, okay, let me apply it in the Ugandan context. And then the result, what I would propose is what you've seen in the Ugandan context, a domain which can be added, or a variable or variables that are unique to the Ugandan context. Andrew, I don't know if I answer your question.
Thank you very much, Doctor.
You're welcome. Ruth, we went off topic, but that would be one of my suggestions. I don't know if others have picked up or you're even more confused.
Yes, Doctor, I've picked something.
Okay. And so it's really for us, especially in ISICT, the most important thing is to remember our fields. Then we try to, like for example, like we said, for your case, Ruth, we are looking at, if you're looking at e-learning in the developing context. Now, the question is there something that has been done? Is there a proposed design approach? Then in this case, we saw a framework that was proposing, and then you say, okay, can I use this framework to develop something and then move further? Develop something and then report back to say whether it's feasible or not feasible for the Ugandan context. Okay, let's go back to our slides. Okay. I think we got this part, the organizing our literature according to the topics. The main topics, those that emphasize relationship with the main research problem, those that emphasize that where the gap is, the literature that emphasizes the research that has been done and what is being proposed to be done, and so on and so forth. So far, are we okay?
Yes, Doctor.
Okay. The final thing, the two final things that we can do to our research is to organize according from general to specific. So basically funnel our research. And this is one of the things that will help us to kick out things that are unnecessary, because you can read so much. You can read so much, but then there are things that are generic and those that are specific. And we want to be, as much as we want to start from the general to specific, we want to move quickly to the specific. We don't want the reader, the external examiner, to get bored and try to, what is this person trying to do? We want the reader to know specifically what to do. Another key point, sorry, I don't want us to just go through slides and finish. There's a key point, that a trick that I wanted, which my supervisor taught me, and I would like to share it with you. Let me see if I can do that. Just give me a minute. I want to just show you something. While I answer, there's somebody who has posted a question. Can literature be generated using the objectives? Yes, it is possible. It depends. Again, it depends on what it is you're trying to research. But yes, literature can be generated using using your objectives. Let me just quickly share something with you. A tip my supervisor gave me to try not to go outside the box. Now, when you begin reading your literature, and as you're reading your literature, you may have this, you pick out what your research problem is. Now, when you begin to write, let us say you want to begin to write your chapter 1. And let us say, can we use Ruth's example? Remember Ruth's the example Ruth gave us of designing an e-learning platform or application that is accessible for the rural. Do you remember her topic? Okay. Now, let us say Ruth wants to begin talking about this topic in chapter 1. She wants to start with the introduction. Now, rather than immediately begin writing, create what we call a chapter structure. Now, Ruth wants to begin communicating in the introduction. And in the introduction, she wants to let the reader know what she's doing, why she's doing it immediately in the introduction. And the introduction should be brief. We know that Ruth wants to do something with e-learning. E-learning that is sensitive to the context. Designing an e-learning platform. Accessible to rural learners. Okay? So we know that's what Ruth wants to do. What can she talk about in her introduction? What can Ruth talk about in her introduction? She can have a statement or a statement or paragraph which is talking about e-learning is now being proposed to learners of all types, especially after COVID. That's the first thing she can start telling us. So immediately someone knows that she wants to talk about e-learning, which is being proposed for all learners, especially those in COVID, especially after the COVID pandemic. Then he said, there is now a demand made to designers IS and application designers to develop accessible e-learning applications for all learners, but more specifically, rural learners in developing countries. So these statements, as she writes them, they are giving an idea of what she needs to write in her introduction, that the reader immediately knows what she's talking about. She will. Otherwise, someone may start writing, "Oh, ICT4D, ICT are now being used for teaching and learning. ICT are being proposed to support the teaching learning process." Then she starts defining ICT, blah 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 blah. But the reader immediately wants to know what it is you're talking about. immediately wants to know, what is your research area about? Then you said it is therefore necessary to determine an approach that supports IS or application designers, that guides, that support application designers in developing applications that are accessible. So then you can say this research will use a proposed framework to design an accessible e-learning application for rural learners in Uganda, and evaluate accessibility after application. Now, Ruth will, if Ruth looks at this, she will know this is what I need to talk about, to immediately let the reader know what I need to do. Then afterwards she can, this is not written yet, it's just outlining what she will talk about. Then you come to the background. The background, you will start organizing yourself to say, what do I first need to talk about? I need to introduce e-learning to the reader. And you know, you said now in this introducing e-learning, I need to probably provide a definition of e-learning. Then give it context. Give it context, especially after the COVID pandemic. The next thing maybe I begin to talk about now the issue of designing applications. So the challenge of rural areas and accessibility to applications and resources for e-learning. So now I'm already telling we are now starting. We are on the generic. We are on the generic. Then someone can say, okay, that's, but I want to now come down to the issue of e-learning and rural areas. So I now go into the deeper part where I discuss, you begin to discuss what has currently been done, what has been done in terms of e-learning What challenges have been identified? And then I begin to talk about now the need for applications that are accessible for all learners, especially rural learners. Proposed solutions. Design solutions. Proposed frameworks, proposed design approaches. Then the specific framework that you want to use that proposes design and implementation of applications for all learners. So now already at this point, by the time your reader goes through this background, they already know where the problem is and what the proposed solution is. So by the time you write your problem statement, you're simply pointing out the need to design an application based on the proposed framework to validate the framework for rural learners. Now, if you notice, already by writing this, the person who's going to write this work can pick out, will know, first of all, what literature they need to find. What literature does this person need to look for? Number one, the literature that talks about e-learning defines it. Literature that pushes for that has pushed for e-learning, especially after the COVID pandemic. In the Ugandan context, what does the Ugandan context now propose? Now, for example, now there is what is proposed for universities is what do they call it? Is that, I forget the name they use, but the kind of the blended learning where you have both physical and the physical context and others. So all that literature that is out there. Then the challenge for rural areas, if you know that's the literature you need to find. Then what is being done in terms of e-learning? What new applications are being proposed? What do we have in the Ugandan context? What challenges have been identified? But this is all brief. Then the need for applications that are accessible for all learners, especially rural learners, especially based on the challenges that are being put forward. The design solutions, what approaches are currently there? You know, we have user-centered approaches and so on and so forth. But there's now a framework that is proposing that you can develop applications for all learners. Let us test this out. Now, do you already see how just this chapter structure, number one, guides you what you're going to write, that you don't go outside of context. Two, that you really bring the reader specific to what it is you want to do. I don't know if this is helpful in any way.
It is super helpful.
Yes, it is.
Yes, so the chapter structure is very, very important. It's one of the things I remember my supervisor really helped me with. I kept writing chapters and I was going off topic, and then he sat me down and said, now start by doing this. And when I did that, I realized I wasn't going off topic. It helped me with my literature review, looking for a specific area of the area that I wanted to write. So for all your chapters, I would suggest do this. It really helps. Okay, let's go back to our lecture slides. Okay. So after you've reviewed your literature, and remember actually from the chapter structure I've given you, you can more or less begin now to formulate a research question or state a hypothesis, depending on where your research is going. You can more or less begin to state what your research question is, what your research objective is, and so on and so forth. This can, from this point on, you can begin to do that. Make sure that you have cited all your sources. Make sure you do that. Key point here, let me also just point out quickly. Let me just stop sharing and just take us back to Google Scholar. If I can just go back to Google Scholar, give me a minute. One of the very nice things about Google Scholar, do you see this thing which says cite? Do you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that which if you've picked out
Yes, doctor.
if you've picked out an article that you're going to use, or you have used it, simply come to cite, click on it, and you see it gives you the reference, the appropriate reference. So find out what UMU uses. I know we use Harvard. But I think they should have given you in the handouts you received, they should have given you the format. So if we're using Harvard, you simply just copy and paste. If you're using something like EndNote, you can copy, you can send this to EndNote if you have it installed on your laptop or something. Send it to EndNote, and EndNote collects all your references, which you later on attach. So this is one of the nice things. It helps you get the format, and you don't have to disturb yourself too much. So that is another trick that I could just share with you quickly. Now, on literature review, sorry, there's a question. Patrick, you have a question, then Tom next.
Yes, doctor. I'm just concerned. Is it a must to have hypotheses in all researches?
No, that's why.
All, especially qualitative?
No. That is why here it says you can be able to formulate your research question or state a hypothesis. So a hypothesis is, well, all research have research questions, whether it be quantitative, qualitative, or a mixed method. All of them have. But this can then be, your research question can be turned into a research objective. Your research question can lead to hypothesis, depending on what type of research it is you're doing, whether it is quantitative, qualitative, or mixed method. It's not all research has hypothesis. So let's make that one clear. When we look at research questions or qualitative versus quantitative research, we shall see this in detail. We shall look at this in detail. Now, some errors that you need to avoid it. Logically organizing your review. I've already given you an idea of how you can logically organize your literature review. Review that isn't focused on the most important facets of your research. Again, the chapter structures that I've given you, those can be very helpful to keep your research focused. Review that is not related to the study. Again, the chapter structure can help. Outdated references. This is a key point that you need to look at. Reviewing literature that isn't written in the author's own words. Or this is where we talk about plagiarism. I think this one you've heard about. If you decide to get something from a published article and put it into your own words and pass it on as your own words, this is key. Now UMU uses Turnitin. So any work that you submit, your work that is submitted is taken through Turnitin. I think it says if you reach a certain threshold, your research work will not be accepted. So key point is to always make reference, or rather always acknowledge work that is not yours. If you get words that if you copy and paste words from a published article, make sure that you cite, you make note that these are not your words. Tom, you have a question? Sorry, I think I had answered Patrick's, but not Tom's question. Yes, Tom.
Yes, Doctor. Mine goes back to the citation method.
Yes.
You said probably the university gave us the citation method.
Yes.
In the booklet, but I personally didn't receive a booklet, and I thought you would clarify on the citation method that UMU uses, so that we have it clear.
Okay. What I will do, let me get a guiding document which I can then pass on to you. I think that would be the best thing. Let me get that document and pass it on to you.
Thank you, Doctor.
Yeah. So just go through these and make sure that these are really, really key points, because they can make or break your work. Like I said, if you have outdated literature, if you have if you have used somebody's words and have not acknowledged the authors, that is one of the things that can easily disqualify your work. And we don't want any of that to happen. Take note on plagiarism, the different guidelines that guide plagiarism.